Hello and welcome to the first in our series of Senedd Election Specials, a co-production of Emma and Tom Talk Teaching and the Impact Podcast. We're doing this series because in the quarter of a century since Wales gained its devolved powers and its assembly, now known as the Senedd, we've never not had a Labour First Minister. Labour has been in power in an unbroken way for a quarter of a century, and indeed Wales has been a stronghold of Labour politics for at least 100 years before that. But the opinion polls are suggesting that we could be looking at a potential change of government. Plaid Cymru and Reform are surging in the opinion polls. In the last Senedd by-election in Caerphilly in October, we saw Labour's vote fall from 46% to 11%, and Plaid Cymru fought off Reform, who at the time were the favourites, to win that seat quite comfortably with around a 10% margin. In the run-up to the elections, Finola, Jane and I thought that it would be worth asking all six of the main parties contesting the Senedd elections to put somebody up to talk to us about education. With so much going on in the news at the moment, education is tending to be squeezed out in the mainstream media channels, and so we thought we would fill that gap in the market with a series of 6 interviews and a thematic analysis programme episode, which we will release just before the polls open. Here on the Emma and Tom Talk Teaching podcast, we'll have post-match analysis after each interview with Dr Gareth Evans, who's the Director of Education Policy at the University of Wales, Trinity, St David. And over on the Impact podcast, Jane and Finola will be doing their own post-match analysis from their point of view. We're 2 slightly different podcasts, so we have 2 slightly different angles on that analysis. The interviews will be coming out 3 times this week, 3 times next week, giving a total of 6. And by the magic of alphabetical order, our very first interview in this series is with the Conservative Party, who've put up Natasha Asghar to speak to us. So here's the interview that she did with Jane, Finola and me.
Welcome to the Impact Podcast in collaboration with Tom Breeze from the Emma and Tom Talk Teaching Podcast and Cardiff Met. Our guest today in our Election Special series is Natasha Asghar, who's Senedd member for the Welsh Conservative Party for South Wales East Region and Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education. Welcome, Natasha.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. And we're just going to start straight off with the questions. We know that standards of attainment in Wales are not what they should be. And PISA has put Wales at the bottom of the 4 nations. Eston's annual report describes the impact of planning for literacy in all phases of schools as remaining too variable, and the teaching of mathematics and numeracy as having persistent weaknesses. What will you, as the Conservative Party, commit to raise standards for Wales? And I just want to mention that at your Conservative Party conference on February the 14th, you committed to reviewing curriculum for Wales. What will you replace it with, and how will it drive up standards of attainment in Wales, especially for the most disadvantaged?
Wow, fantastic question. And I'm glad you kicked off with such a poignant question. Okay, so with regards to teachers, I think they do a phenomenal job. I'll begin by saying that. I also feel that they need to be, I think our teaching system needs to be led by teachers and heads because they know the system better than anybody. With regards to curriculum for Wales, I believe that I have heard certain cases where it's been good, but the majority of feedback that I'm receiving is quite negative in relation to curriculum Wales. So from my perspective, I've also looked at what Scotland did, and they introduced something very similar to curriculum for Wales, and their PISA scores went down, standards went down, and unfortunately, it's something that now the SNP government that's in place in Scotland is having to completely try and overhaul and try and redo over, basically. I want us to have a system and a curriculum that works for everybody and works for the best, for the children in Wales to get the best out of the education that they receive. So I have committed to saying that if I need to, and if Curriculum Wales doesn't improve standard, and if I see that literacy and numeracy is not on the rise, then I will certainly look into scrapping it and creating something, but not creating something by myself, because I am not an educational expert in the slightest, but I want to carry individuals like yourselves who are in that field, who know what they're talking about, know what's best for the children, to be able to lead a curriculum that works for everybody.
So you're looking at, potentially, if it's required, replacing Curriculum for Wales with an expert-led creation of something different?
knowledge-based system. That's what I really want to see in Wales, and I want the right people in the job to be able to spearhead that, to be created and then taken forward.
Right, so a knowledge-based curriculum. There's just something else that I want to talk about in terms of professional learning. Obviously, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that reading, judging by questions in the Senedd plenary, has really been in the news recently. And of course, it's highly linked with academic success. What will your party do to ensure that every child learns to read well early?
Oh, I'm a huge believer in systematic synthetic phonics. I know that there's been a huge battle in the Senedd about queuing versus SSP. And pardon me, I do like to use SSP because systematic synthetic phonics is a mouthful at the best of times. So I'm an advocate of SSP. I appreciate that I'm a conservative, and I know that the Conservatives in Westminster have made their errors over 14 years, which we're constantly hearing about on a regular basis. But if there's one thing they got right, it was education. And I was really privileged because I wanted to understand more. I'm new to this role. I've only been doing it for a year and a bit, as I like to say. So in that time, I wanted to gain as much knowledge as I could. So I could set up my own literacy panel because I was unhappy with what the Welsh Government has set up, which was a literacy panel, but filled with experts, which is great, but who only focus predominantly on queuing. And I think that's very unfair. To have a proper panel, to have a proper discussion, to have a proper system in place, you need to see the best of both worlds. And I do understand that there were a lot of flaws, particularly within that group. So I set up my own. I was very privileged to have some great people on there, including Senedd Gibb as well, who was pivotal in creating a system of education in England, which did really, really well. And I noticed that standards went on the rise in England, but sadly, they haven't gone in that direction here in Wales. So for me personally, I want to see the introduction of SSP. I want to see it in all schools. I appreciate that there are some children with special needs who will perhaps still need the assistance of queuing. And I'm not going to negate from that in the certain cases that is needed. But I want other children to be, or the remainder of children, or in fact, the majority of children, to have SSP as the main format of how they are taught how to read.
I just want to clarify something. You just mentioned there that for me personally, is this a Welsh Conservatives policy, or is this something that you, right,
No,
so it's a Welsh
Conservative policy.
Fabulous. Just wanted to clarify that. Can we move now to questions about professional learning?
Thanks, Vin. There's been an enormous shift in the way in which teachers are supported to provide the education every child deserves over the last few years. We've had inspection moving from once in every 6 years to twice a cycle. We've got consortia no longer driving professional learning at schools with the help of LAs, and we've got the Dysgu and Adnod, our new professional learning organisations. It's early days with those organisations. And given the very fractured nature of the current professional learning landscape in Wales, what will you do to ensure that professional learning support that teachers are provided with is really indeed the support that they need?
100%. I'm a complete advocate of sharing best practice. And I've visited, well, I was going to say countless schools across South East Wales, which I have. And I've spoken to teachers. And one thing that they feel that they're lacking is the sharing of best practices. Often teachers are the first ones to hear the criticisms of a poor Eston report. They're the first ones to hear, abuse from parents and from politicians, the like, for example, standards not being of a good level within the school itself. So there are other schools that are performing well. I believe in giving teachers the opportunity to learn from others who are doing it well and doing it right, to be able to be given that time to have it. When you mentioned Dysgu, I'll be honest with you, I know you said Dysgu is in early days, and I appreciate that. But if I'm honest with you, having done this job for a long time, I'm still a little bit oblivious as to what Dysgu's purpose actually is. What actually are they going to do? So for me, I want to define if Dysgu is going to remain in the next Senedd term. I want clear layouts of what exactly they're there for. I want them to, if they're there to provide a supportive role, how are they going to do it? I'm a huge believer in measurements. I know many people in the Senedd hate it. There are two things that I like to be very particular about: A, finances, and secondly, what are your points when it comes to achievements? What are your sort of grading systems? How are you going to assess the successes of what you're there to do? So for me, Dysgu is a bit of a unknown entity right now. I want to see how they perform, what they do, because I haven't gained much clarity from the Cabinet Secretary as of present. And I want to make sure that not only best practices are shared, but I want any organisation, anybody that's there to provide a supportive role to actually be clear. And I want to gain feedback from the teachers, from the heads, as to how important or how helpful they are. And in cases when they're not helpful, for example, if something isn't working, we need to figure out a way very quickly how we can turn it around, how it can actually provide that support to teachers, which is necessary, as opposed to just being a body that's getting millions of pounds of funding, but is providing very little support for the teachers.
So to clarify there, talking about professional learning, that the the gold standard of professional learning is about schools supporting schools and having that best practice sharing between schools.
It is part of it. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a huge part for me that I want to see. I also want teachers to be able to be given time. That's the one issue that teachers often mention, that they want to develop their skills, they want to excel, they want to develop the practices that they've been learning, they want to share best practices, but they're not being given the time to do so. So in that fact, I've been to Finland, I've looked at how the system works there, and there's a great system of working with schools, being able to provide that support, which we're looking to do. And also with educational institutions, for example, Open University, we've had a conversation when I was preparing the manifesto for the Conservatives this year. I want to be able to ensure teachers are given more time. So something that I was looking at, and I'd love to hear your perspective on as to what you think. We have a lot of teachers who are training to be teachers, and very little, and many of them say that when they go into schools, they have very little experience, apart from when they've got the job and they're in the classroom, of actually teaching. So I want to see if we can incorporate into degrees themselves the opportunity for trainee teachers or teachers of the future to go into schools, have that experience, build it into the university curriculum so they get first-hand experience of what it's like managing a class of 20 children, for example, in a primary school. And whilst they're doing that, have the support of teachers within the school, but it gives that teacher who's teaching that particular class the opportunity to go and do their training as well. So I know it sounds a bit different, but that's something that I've looked into in depth as well.
I'm going to hand over to Tom to respond to that and put you on the spot here there, Tom.
Yeah.
Obviously, Tom is more ITE than we are.
So when you say degrees, do you mean degrees other than ones leading to qualified teacher status? Are you calling for placements, or are we talking about student teachers here?
This is for individuals who are studying to become teachers, whether that be in a PGCE element, whether that be just an undergrad in teaching, and even PhD students are welcome to do it. I mean, in Finland, PhD students are going into classrooms, teaching and helping and supporting mainstream teachers to be able to go off and do research projects, to be able to further their learning. Why can't we bring something like that here in Wales?
I see, because obviously a PGCE student would be in school doing teaching, but they need to be looked after and given feedback and support.
Of course, no, and the support is there. The heads are there to support. The teacher obviously will be there to initially support, but once they're happy to fly solo, that teacher will then be able to be given time to be able to go and have that training, that development that they want to do that course, and whether it be to upgrade their first aid skill, it could be anything, but be able to have that time to be able to go ahead. And that will obviously alleviate the burden of resources which are falling on schools to be able to find cover for teachers to be able to go and do that training or get that support that they want to be able to flourish themselves. But it also gives those new up and coming teachers the opportunity to go into classroom and do what they're there to do, and we're hopefully going to be doing for years to come.
Let's talk about funding then, because we are seeing more and more schools now in deficit budgets. It feels like it's becoming widespread enough that we can say it's probably not just a few irresponsible profligate schools, spending all their money. It appears to be a systemic problem. Now, a number of parties are coming up with policies around the funding of schools. We might expect perhaps the Conservative Party to be a little bit more circumspect on issues of funding, but can you give a commitment that you're going to look at ensuring that schools are not in deficit budgets? Because it's hard for them to raise standards and do the right thing by their pupils if they've got no money.
No, I appreciate that, and I completely understand where you're coming from. Often schools that I speak to, that I go into, they're often saying that we are struggling with school budgets. Some of them need a new canteen where they have leaky roofs and all sorts of things, and they're health hazards for children, which ultimately none of us want to see, and I personally don't want to see either, nor does my party. So from my perspective, we need to review the funding model. There are a lot of funding models that we talk about, but I think particularly with schools, we do need to review it. We have seen a surge in young children who need more support for ALN. A lot of budgetary requirements go towards that as well. So taking that into account, I don't want to see schools being deprived of funding that they duly need, but I think that we will, as a party, 100% look into reviewing the education funding system that we have here in Wales for sure.
And not unconnected to the funding question, I mean, there has been some talk about academies in Conservative policy things coming out recently, but which are obviously in English innovation brought in by the Blair government originally, but actually adopted by the Conservative government. They felt that was a good thing. You've suggested that might improve standards, contribute to improving standards, although the evidence on that, it doesn't seem to be absolutely rock solid. And on the funding point, I just wondered what Welsh taxpayers may think about some of those, £200,000, £250,000 salaries that multi-academy trust CEOs are being paid over the border.
So listen, academies are a topic that I know a lot of people ask me about, and it's a question that I'm happy to answer. And I'm not shy of saying academies do have their benefits. I mean, I've seen academies in England. I lived there for quite some time. It's no secret, and they have done really well for themselves. I've seen young children from really deprived backgrounds going to some fantastic universities, and their futures have been very much brightened by the fact that they've attended an academy. Appreciate it's a completely new concept here in Wales, and like you said, that the results are quite different. And I appreciate the funding model, which you mentioned, of certain, heads being paid salaries which rival CEOs and very well-known mainstream companies. Naturally, we want to look into bringing what the system is and the standards that we see in academies of good behavior, good attendance with regards to good results. But also we need to be financially prudent in how we go about that. So we will look into it. If there is an area or there's a need for an academy, I don't have anything against it personally. I appreciate the word academy tends to make everyone sort of shudder a little bit when we talk about it, because immediately they start thinking £150,000 salaries for the heads. That's not what we're going to be pursuing and pushing for, but we want to maintain a good standard. So if there are particular areas in Wales where there's a desire to see an academy, or if there's a desire by parents to say, you know what, we want to have a bit more control with regards to how the school is run because we're not happy, we want to see an academy here, we'll certainly look into it. But at the moment, no one's come up to me in droves and said we need to have an academy hypothetically in Newport or Swansea or, further up in North Wales. So if indeed the time comes, we'll certainly look into it. But like I said, no one has come to me with reams and reams of signatures saying we want to have one. So we'll hold fire until that happens.
And free schools, because they were a flagship Conservative party.
I mean, there is a benefit. I mean, with regards to free schools, there are benefits to them. But until there's a huge demand or a need for it, I think we'll hold our horses to that point.
Something I just wanted to come back to that you talked about earlier on was measurement. And obviously, particularly for reading, data in Wales, we're a little bit of a data desert. So is there anything in terms of the Welsh Tory policy that you think should change in order to support a rise in standards in terms of measurement?
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that one. And I think with regards to, we always talk about PISA results, and I appreciate how important they are. I'm not making humor out of it, but I have been very persistent with telling the Cabinet Secretary that we are very poor, and I agree with you 100% that when it comes to data collection, and that's in education, that's in health, that's in every area, that's certainly a big failure of the Welsh Labour government. I think Cabinet Secretary, the ministers, First Ministers are fully aware of that fact, because we've made it apparent in committee meetings as well as plenary sessions and even face-to-face encounters. So I think with regards to education, one thing I pushed the Cabinet Secretary for, which she's done, is she signed up Wales to TIMS and PELS, which will hopefully give us a bit more clarity on stats, because I like to have KPI. I mentioned earlier, I like to have point guards, but KPI is what I'm looking for. I like key performance indicators to show me where I'm at, to be able to figure out where we're going. It's so important to have that structure in place, because at the moment we're just going on. We've often said that 20% of children are leaving school functionally illiterate. It's a fact that we often keep blaring at the government, although they denied it very blatantly to my face yesterday. And when I asked them, so what is the actual figure? Everyone went silent. So that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to roll off our tongues without any shadow of a doubt what is the state of education, how many children are leaving school functionally illiterate. But if that figure is not there, that's a big concern. So for me, not only do I want to get onto TIMS and PELS as quickly as possible, and I know there is a bit of a delay because it works in cycles, which is what I've been told. So once we get on that next cycle, we can see where we're at, and like I said, plan for the future then accordingly.
What about the, obviously there's a phonics screening test that's being used in England that's linked very much with their systematic synthetic phonics programme. Is that something that you might consider being used in Wales?
Can I just say, honestly, I want the best educational standard for children. I don't say that just because of an election. I say it because I truly mean it. And for me, I will take on any program. I will trial and test anything we can to improve the standards of literacy in Wales, because for me, it's so important. I grew up in a home, and I'll just share this with you. I tell everyone this. I grew up in a home where I may not have had 4 holidays in a year like some children, or had a flashy holiday house or flashy car when I turned 17 or anything. My parents always said to me, if there's one thing no one in this world can take away from you, it's your education. And I'm a firm believer in that. Wherever you go to school, whether it's private, comprehensive, whatever, it's so, so important. So for me, I'm happy to trial and test any method, like I said, that will increase standards and will give us some guidance as to where children are at in order to take our next generation further in education.
So you certainly wouldn't rule it out. Okay, so I think we've covered all of the questions that we had on our list, but before we go, obviously our listeners are teachers, head teachers, educators from across Wales. Is there something that you would like to tell them, the message from the Welsh Conservative Party about what you are going to be promising to change about education in Wales?
So as I said in the beginning, I know that we, as a party, we have quite a bad reputation. But one thing I'm a huge believer of, and one thing I've done in every role and position that I've had, whether that's been transport, education, young people, children, is that I want to work with you. I'm not here to work against you. I'm happy to take all your feedback, all of your views on board. I'm not one of those people who's a dictator and says my way or the highway. I want to create a balanced approach. I appreciate that the system is not perfect in any shape or form at the moment, but I understand the needs of teachers. I understand the struggles of heads. I appreciate that the Welsh Government has set up lots of different bodies and tangos and all sorts of things regarding education. But if I'm honest with you, and this is me speaking on behalf of my party, we're not seeing much of a difference. And it's fine to keep throwing, it's not fine to keep throwing money at bodies where you're not seeing results. And for me, I'm more than happy to redirect that money, those millions and millions of pounds that's being spent on these random little organizations, dusties of the sort that are being created, to create a way and a system that works best for you, because you're the ones who are going to, like I said, be shaping our future generation. You know best, and I'm happy to follow your lead on this.
Natasha Asghar, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this morning. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
So that was our interview with Natasha Asghar, who was representing the Conservative Party. And Gareth, what grabbed you from that?
Dr. Breeze. An interesting conversation as ever. Lots going on. You covered, I think, nearly every possible base in a short time. So, well done for doing that. There are a couple of things, weren't there, that leapt out. The one that leapt out to me most obviously, I think, was her reference to potential scrapping of the curriculum for Wales. By my understanding, probably the first of your esteemed political guests to have done so. Everybody else has kind of tiptoed around the edge of that one, but she was quite, a lot bolder in saying, well, if it's not working and if we continue to drop in, and she made reference, didn't she, repeated reference to PISA. She talked about literacy and numeracy. She's seen the data, she's seen the stats that we've all seen, and she has made a pretty bold call there and saying, look, if it continues to spiral downwards, we're going to scrap it and do something else, which I thought was a bit of a line, actually, a bit of a scoop, Tom.
Well, it was a bit of a bold move there, wasn't it? She's not saying they want to do it definitely, but she's saying if standards don't start moving in the right direction, that's going to happen. And it was interesting that she made repeated reference to England, and there are those who would say that the Conservative, initially coalition government, and then the Conservative government did do a number on education, did manage to get certain numbers moving in the right direction. It was interesting that she's obviously, or the party have obviously decided they're going to front up to the electorate and admit that the Conservative Party currently is not a popular prospect. But at one point she qualified by basically saying, but the thing that they did do well was education.
Yeah, and she also made reference, didn't she, to the long-serving and probably long-suffering education minister in England, Nick Gibbs. So she's been calling upon certain friends in England for advice. And yes, you're quite right. It's been a slight anomaly to me that England has risen, quite significantly and strikingly in PISA to above OECD averages. England continues to outperform a good number of European sort of equivalents in Tims and Pearls. So England, one could argue, has gone in a distinctly better direction than the Welsh education system in the last 10 to 15 years. Yet we almost routinely, don't we, as a country, as a political establishment, dismiss whatever it is that they do. When one has to ask the question, if we're going to Ireland and looking at what Ireland's doing, we're going to Scotland and pretty much jumping on the back of everything they do, why aren't we looking at some of and look, there are dubious things happening in England, things that our friends and colleagues from across the border come over and say, don't do here. But there must be some things they're getting demonstrably right. So yeah, why don't we, Tom? Why don't we explore with a little more detail what England is doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Although I would say what was a very interesting point of difference was her very emollient, very constructive, collaborative tone towards the teaching profession. Lots of talk about listening to the teaching profession, whereas if you go back to the start of the education reforms in England, which were brought in during the Tory Lib Dem coalition government and David Cameron and Nick Clegg, of course, the famous education secretary at the time, Michael Gove, a name still, not talked of with great affection by teachers over in England, and his power behind the throne, Dominic Cummings, before he shot to fame with his Barnard Castle eye test during COVID, were not known for an emollient approach towards the teaching profession. So while Natasha Asghar is obviously looking to draw on perhaps the achievements and some of the moves in the right direction, she appears to have recognised that maybe the approach, all the talk of the blob and all that kind of thing, perhaps may not wash.
No, and I think that is probably a fair assessment, and she's right, isn't she? And we've spoken before on this very podcast that teachers matter, and she's recognised, therefore, and she talked a lot about finding time for the profession, which is something that I think all of us would support and get behind. One wonders where that time will come from in a busy school day, in a busy school year. Will probably require some sort of funding injection to free up some space to get more teachers into classrooms, to get teachers away from the chalk face, as it were, for that professional learning. But she also had this idea, didn't she, about getting more people into schools to train, to teach, to become future teachers. I know that's something that probably raised eyebrows with you, as it did me.
Yes, I think so. I mean, let's start by giving credit where it's due. I would say that pretty much all of the other interviews have acknowledged that there is an issue with professional learning for teachers and also workload and capacity. But most of the interviews have sort of stopped there or given some sort of vague suggestion that they want to do something about it. So I will give Natasha Asghar credit for the fact that she's actually come up with an idea, which was, as you say, this idea that, as far as I could understand from trying to clarify the detail with her initial teacher education students, but also other types of students, she mentioned PhD students, could be used to sort of sit with, to supervise classes while their regular teacher went off and did professional learning. Now, I mean, you and I both work in teacher education institutions, and we sort of know that firstly, initial teacher education students are already doing a lot of teaching and are also not supposed to be supervising classes on their own. And we also know the sort of administrative nightmares that would ensue if some random PhD student decided they wanted to teach year 9 next Wednesday afternoon. I think probably politely that is an idea which you can sort of briefly credit for its creativity, but which is probably going to remain on the drawing board and probably never fly.
Yeah, and I think, again, respecting her innovation, she kind of suggested that this, or she implied that this sort of thing wasn't already happening, and I just thought that was odd, that it was kind of a novel idea that student teachers would go into school and spend time in school. I mean, as you and I well know, the whole IT operation dies a very quick and painful death if schools do not accommodate student teachers. I mean, they are the lifeblood of ITE. So that was kind of a misunderstanding, I would think, of the current teacher training, teacher education provision in Wales. I don't doubt that there are issues. There are things that we all need to think anew and address. But a lot of this comes down to funding, to support, and to, let's face it, workload. Schools are grappling with all manner of different things. And in my experience, very, very good schools who would love to get involved in ITE can't because of their commitments to other stuff. So until you free up that financial space, physical space, sometimes within a school building, a school's environment, we're always going to come back to these same sort of issues around getting more teachers. And that was something I think, was it the Tories, perhaps ahead of the general election, a year or two ago were talking about injecting, tens of thousands of more teachers into the profession. I don't know from memory what the Welsh Conservatives are looking to do in Wales, but this idea that you can just sort of go out and find all these sitting sort of waiting teachers, this sort of waiting pool of teachers who are just sat there waiting to be picked up is just ludicrous.
Yes, a little bit strange. And as you rightly say, ITE is in the nicest way, is a drain on schools. Schools have to do stuff in IT. They're not a sort of gold mine of resource sitting there waiting to supervise classes. I asked Natasha Asghar about academies and free schools, because, again, that's a flagship policy of the English conservative sort of education setup. And I'd had the impression by pre-reading some of the material that has come out from the Conservative Party here in Wales that they were really quite keen on the idea of introducing academies. Free schools less so, but I cheekily asked the question. But she was much more lukewarm about them than I expected.
Yeah, and let's be clear, Tom, that this is an idea that's been sort of bandied about for some years in Wales. I think probably first hatched from memory a decade or so ago, maybe. Prior to that, there was some serious talk and public talk actually about the resurgence in some form of grammar schools. So I think there's always been this sort of penchant for selection in Wales, akin to that we still see. I mean, there are still grammar schools operating in England, but increasingly now, of course, the academisation of schools in England. I have certain issues with it. I would be concerned, and I know you picked up quite rightly on the pay issue and the fact that we'd be paying these eye-watering sums to individuals to manage academies. But I have issue around the potential for even more variation and inequity across the system if you get different academies being allowed to do different things. It's kind of privatization, I think, through the back door almost. But I'd also worry about our capacity to actually support them, because academy trusts, of course, are made up of, they're kind of glorified governance structures, aren't they? They're made up of business leaders and charities and university experts. Imagine me and you on such a trust. I'm not sure that would last too long, Tom. But I worry about our capacity to actually support these things. So again, it's one of those sort of interesting ideas that might be explored, might be tested, might be piloted, but is it actually doable? And yeah, the grammar school stuff, a little vignette for you. I gave a talk. So in fact, I'd shared a talk some decade or so ago. It was well over a decade, that was looking at this particular Tory policy of the possible reintroduction of grammar schools. And I had a really mixed audience. I remember it very well, actually. And an older gentleman spoke very, very passionately against grammar schools, having gone through it, 40, 50, 60 years ago himself. And he was still visibly scarred by it. And I'll never forget it, actually. So I'm, I'll put it out there, very anti grammar school and very anti-selection, and that's my personal view. But what I'm saying, I think, in a roundabout way, is if such a policy was to be revived or introduced in Wales, there would be a real job of work about communication and bringing people with you, explaining to people the benefits, particularly those who have long memories and have been through similar processes in the past. It's not like other policy that you could just flick a switch and everybody just rolls with the curriculum. You just get on with it. There is a legacy, a long history here, and lots of disgruntled people who are quite rightly, I think, concerned about the possibility.
Yeah, and she really did seem to think that unless there was a strong groundswell of support for it out in the country, she wasn't sort of that desperate to bring it in, which was an interesting line.
Yeah, there we are. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, and of course, in terms of seeing what happens, here in Wales, we have a proportional system, which tends not to produce overall majorities. And so we do like to mischievously consider what possible hookups we may see between parties. I think it's fair to say that the Conservative Party will not be the single largest party come the day after polling day. So then, of course, the question is, will there be a kingmaker? The obvious choice would be if Reform turned out to be a large party. But then, of course, over in England, Kemi Badenoch's been very clear that there is to be no pact with Reform. I was quite tempted to ask about Wales, but even I have a line where mischief is concerned.
Yes, yeah, and I think you're probably right to steer clear of that one. This is an educational podcast after all, rather than an inherently political one. Hey, but look, you started, I think, very generously by giving credit to her where it's due. If I was to look back on that interview in the round, I would say she was well read. She is clearly abreast of the issues, perhaps in part because of what you've just said, the Tories having been in power in Westminster, having understood education reasonably well over that time, or got to understand education reasonably well over that time. She's picked up bits and pieces here and there. She's been advised by people who went through that process. So, she's not coming to this like some others have with a completely clean slate. But it would be interesting, I think, wouldn't it, if the Tories were ever to find themselves in a position of power in Wales, to see whether or not they would be true and loyal to the English approach, or whether they would, as you say, take a more nuanced approach. And you're right, I think she suggested the latter, didn't she, that she'd pick up bits and pieces from her pals across the border, but broadly speaking, she'd look to put a bit of a Welsh spin on it.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Gareth. That's the first of our post-interview analysis sessions. Gareth will be back with me in a couple of days when we'll be talking about the interview with the candidate from the Green Party, which I think it's fair to say, Gareth, was a little bit of a different experience for us. So look forward to that when it comes into your feed tomorrow. But for now, from Gareth and from me, bye for now. You've been listening to a Senedd Election Special brought to you by Emma and Tom Talk Teaching and the Impact Podcast. Today's guest was Natasha Asghar from the Conservative Party, and you also heard Jane Miller and Finola Wilson from Impact Wales, Dr Gareth Evans from the University of Wales Trinity St David, and me, Tom Breeze. The interview was produced by Darren Evans.